Khrushchev speaks of war and peace in the light of what he calls the new means of mass destruction. But Khrushchev recognizes another category, which he calls wars of liberation and popular revolt, but which we prefer to call subversion and covert aggression. It is these wars which Khrushchev says are not only admissible, but inevitable. A free world's answer, tested during a year in Vietnam, is counterinsurgency. At the request of the South Vietnamese government, we are helping peace-loving people learn how to defend themselves. Here, in a remote setting, there is new emphasis on the importance of the individual fighting man, as a teacher as well as a leader. Our troops are here to advise and train the South Vietnamese, but fight only to defend themselves, on assignments which often take them into the midst of a bitter and dangerous struggle. In this conflict, it is harder to find the enemy than to fight him. The plan to protect those who dwell in thousands of rural villages and towns resulted in the fortifying of approximately 5,000 communities in the first year. During an intensive visit to Southeast Asia, Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara sees how the Fortified Hamlet program is working out. Teamwork and on-the-spot training call for dedication from the man in the field to the top commander, General Paul D. Harkins.
The U.S. effort to our Vietnamese allies is a vast and comprehensive one. It involves political, economic, psychological, and military measures. All of the armed forces of the U.S. play a part.
We've put over about 3 million of them into what I would call a concentration camp. They call it a refugee center. It's got barbed wire around it, they can't get out of it. We're taking these people from the graves of their ancestors, from their rice paddies. And we say, oh, well, we've pacified X million people. Yeah, we've pacified some more people by putting them in these camps.
Now, America wins the wars that she undertakes, make no mistake about it. And we have declared war on tyranny and aggression. If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
I'm Roger Hilsman. I was Director of Intelligence and Research in the State Department under John F. Kennedy, and then Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs under Kennedy and for a while under President Johnson. There were two things that he very, very much wished to avoid. One was making this an American war. As he used to say, it's their war, the South Vietnamese. We can give them aid, we can even give them advisors. But they must win it or lose it. And I think he was fully prepared to let them lose it rather than make it an American war. He felt that if we put Americans in there, it would drive, with their white faces, it would drive communism into the, nationalism into the arms of communism. The second thing he wished to avoid was internationalizing the war, as we called it. By this we meant bombing the North or attacking the North. First and foremost, because it would not work. And here, 30-some-odd months of bombing has shown that his judgment was right.
Every day, someone jumps up and shouts and says, tell us what is happening in Vietnam and why are we in Vietnam and how did you get us into Vietnam? Well, I didn't get you into Vietnam. You've been in Vietnam 10 years.
Johnson made it McNamara's war. I want them to get off their butts and get out in those jungles and whip hell out of some communists, he said.
It is the melancholy law of human societies to be compelled sometimes to choose a great evil in order to ward off a greater evil.
Lyndon Baines Johnson. Born in 1908, He grew up in a comfortable middle-class home in Johnson City. At an early age, Lyndon showed a keen interest in politics. From the beginning, he was driven by a determination to win, whatever the cost.
In a word, he was ruthless. There wasn't anything he wouldn't do to get what he wanted, regardless of what it was. And probably the best example would be in 1948 when he was running for the Senate. And he was running against a man named Coke Stevenson. And the election was very, very close.
The race was so close there was no way to call it. The lead seesawed back and forth.
I said, I think you're going to win it. He said, no, I think we've lost it. And I said, no, it's going to be the reversal of 1941.
3 days after the polls closed, the votes were still coming in, and Stevenson led by a handful. It looked as if Stevenson would be the new senator from Texas. But Johnson remembered 1941. He was not about to lose again. The election now hinged on the Duke of Duval County, George Parr, the man who controlled the votes in South Texas.
George Parr controlled that county, and those people voted the way he wanted them to vote. No question about that. None whatever. Now, the candidates had nothing to do with it.
In the nature of things, you don't write down, bought these votes, yesterday afternoon at 4 o'clock. But obviously there was some understanding between the Johnson people and the political bosses in South Texas.
In the tiny South Texas town of Alice, 6 days after the polls had closed, 202 additional votes were reported from precinct box 13. When they were counted, all but 2 were for Lyndon Johnson. When the signatures of the 202 new voters were examined, some say the names were all written in the same ink and listed in alphabetical order.
It did look to me like there had been a change in ink, and it looked like 200 or 202 or 3 names had been added to the poll list in a different ink by a different hand. Mr. Stevenson was an outraged man that felt like the election had been stolen from him, and he felt like what he'd just seen was evidence of that.
Stevenson challenged the election at the Texas State Democratic Convention. It was no use. The Johnson forces were too powerful. When it was all over, precinct box number 13 made the difference. Johnson won by 87 votes. But the question of a stolen election remained. 19 years later, Ronnie Duggar met in the White House with President Lyndon Johnson and asked him about the election of 1948.
One night up in his bedroom, he started laughing and he seemed to wonder if he could find something, and he said he was going back into Bird's bedroom, which was next door. And he rummaged around in a closet. I think I could hear him rummaging around in the closet, and he came in with this photograph of these 5 guys in front of this old car with box 13 balanced on the hood of it. I looked at him and grinned, and he grinned back. But he wouldn't explain it to me. I asked him, well, who were these guys? Why did they have box 13 on the hood of this car? What did it mean? And he just, nothing. He wouldn't say.
And that stuck with him the rest of his life.
That rigged ballot became the template for a political career based on bribery and corruption. The full extent of Johnson's criminal activity only began to unravel 11 years after his death. In 1984, at this courthouse in Franklin, Texas, a former Johnson business associate, Billy Celestes, appeared before a grand jury.
According to Billy Celestes, there were 8 murders perpetrated on the part of Lyndon Johnson. The first name was a man named Douglas Kinzer. That was followed by a number of men involved in Estes businesses who were corrupt, and they were all killed with carbon monoxide. Josepha Johnson's name is listed on this Justice Department document. That's Lyndon Johnson's sister. So Estes is accusing the Vice President of the United States of murdering his own sister. And the 8th name listed is the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. And then there is a promise of knowing more. And if Billy Celestes is telling the truth, and there is every reason to believe he is, it gives you an idea of the depth of the corruption and the ruthlessness of Lyndon Johnson.
According to Estes' written testimony, that murderous cycle began in 1951 in Austin, Texas, at this downtown golf course known as Butler's Pitch and Putt. The killer was a Johnson henchman called Malcolm Wallace.
Malcolm Wallace was born and raised in Texas. He was Texas bred, Texas educated.